Hello and welcome to Podcraft. It's Matthew with you here on my own this week, so I want to do something bite-sized. We're going to give you 3 quick tips for running brilliant podcast surveys. So if you want to better understand your podcast's impact, there's really no better way to do this than to ask your audience directly. Now, you might be surveying purely for your own insights to make better content decisions, or you might be planning to share findings with your audience or the wider industry that you're in. Either way, the principles here are the same. So let's get into our 3 tips that will help you create surveys that people actually want to complete and that give you the insights that you're really after. So the first tip is to think about what story this data could tell you or what decision it could help you make. So with this, you're making sure that every single question in there has a purpose and it earns its place. Before you write a single question, you need to ask yourself, what insight am I trying to uncover? This might be, what story will this data help me tell if you're creating a report to share? Or what decisions do I need to make about my podcast if this is really for your own understanding? So here's a useful exercise. Imagine the ideal data at the end of it all. What insights might emerge there? This isn't about loading questions to make the data say what you want. It's about thinking through what angles might be genuinely useful, regardless of how people answer. The magic often happens when you combine answers too. People who listen during commutes also prefer shorter episodes, or long-time listeners are more likely to engage with premium content, stuff like that. So let's say you're thinking about changing your episode format. You wouldn't ask a broad question like, what podcast formats do you like? You could ask instead something like, when you have a 20-minute window, do you start a new episode or do you finish one that you've already begun? Or have you ever stopped listening mid-episode because it felt too long? So questions like this, they build towards a specific story about optimal length and structure, and you're going to have a lot more interesting and insightful data to work from off the back of that. Another angle could be if you're thinking about sponsorships. So you wouldn't just ask, do you like ads? You would ask, when you discover something interesting in an episode, what do you do next? And these questions, they kind of reveal actual behaviours around recommendations and things like purchasing decisions as well. Any podcaster who's ever run a survey, and I include myself in this, I think we've all been guilty of throwing the odd irrelevant question in there, questions that seem fun or interesting, but going back to the start, they really just don't earn their keep. They don't have a real place in there of any value. So, for example, if you're asking about the listener's pets or hobbies, and they have nothing to do with your topic or the data or anything, any insight you're trying to uncover, then these are things that they might be fun or interesting to know, but unless you're going to do something with that, I would just leave it out altogether, because you're just adding to the workload of the survey. It's taking up valuable survey real estate, for lack of a better term. So every question in there should ladder up to a decision that you actually need to make about your podcast or a story that you're looking to tell in any sort of public report or content that you might be creating. So moving on to our second survey tip, and this one is to use multiple choice options whenever possible. So here's the thing, asking people to write is hard work. The more you ask them to type out responses, the fewer people will bother. So you want to do as much multiple choice options as possible, but this obviously means that your multiple choice options, the ones you provide, they need to be pretty spot on, or at least as close to spot on as we could realistically manage. So you think about it, instead asking what do you like about the show and just a big empty text box there, instead you're maybe asking something like, which of these aspects keeps you coming back? And then your listen specific options, the interview style, the weekly news roundup or tool of the week, or it could even be the host's sense of humour. You're providing this list of options rather than just leaving this big empty box for them to come up with something themselves and write it all out. So when you're testing any survey, particularly ones filled with multiple choice options, Test this with a small group of people before you fire it out to absolutely everyone. So if you have 3 or 4 regular listeners that maybe are in your community and you're in quite close touch with, maybe you could offer it to them first. Even, other podcasters, they might spot wee holes there. But that's the purpose of this, is before it goes out to the masses, if 3 or 4 people could run through it, they might say, well, you've provided this multiple choice question here, but actually the answer I was looking for, it's not there. And that is a signpost that you might need to add something in. With that said, you're never going to cover every edge case here. There'll always be an answer somebody's looking for that simply isn't there. And if you're going to list any more than, I'd say 8 to 10, things start to get a bit silly then, a bit counterproductive. So if the software, whatever software that you're using allows for it, just always add in an other option, and that leads them to a text box as well. So it's still giving people the opportunity to leave the answer that they want, but these should generally be edge cases. The common answer should be accounted for in your multiple choice options. But having this other option is a safety net for catching responses you kind of didn't anticipate, without having to list out every conceivable answer in advance. All right, then on to tip number 3, and that is to save the demographic stuff for the end, if at all. So this might sound obvious, but you'd be surprised how many surveys start with questions like, what's your age, what's your gender, where do you live? And when you start with personal questions like that, it could create immediate friction. So people open up and they start doing it, and they're thinking to themselves, this is a wee bit forward, and they maybe get a bit uncomfortable and they stop doing it. But if you ask those questions at the end, after somebody's already clicked through, they've invested 4 or 5 minutes thinking about your show or thinking about your content or their content, whatever you're asking, they're kind of invested in the survey, and it feels a bit more natural to answer those demographic questions at the end. Again, if they want to, there's always going to be opt-outs like prefer not to say, or you just don't make them mandatory. But at the end of your survey, people have told you a lot, and asking for their age and location, it feels like completing a profile rather than some sort of interrogation. And tying things back up to tip 1, there's nothing to say that you need to ask any demographic questions at all. So if you've no compelling reason for it, then I would just leave them out altogether. Again, that comes back to what are you trying to do here? What are you trying to say? What are you trying to learn? And are demographic questions going to be useful for that? Maybe, but maybe not. And if not, just leave them out altogether. So there you have it. That's 3 quick tips for creating surveys that people actually want to fill out. Think story or data first. Provide as much multiple choice answers as possible, but make those choices count and save the personal stuff for last. Remember, a good survey respects your listeners' time while giving you the actionable insights that you're looking for. So get that balance right, and you'll be amazed at what your audience will tell you and what you'll be able to learn. As I mentioned at the start, your survey might be entirely private, like all the data is geared towards you learning more about your audience and rebuilding your structure to optimize your content for them, or your survey might be an attempt to put together a report within your topic or niche. So presenting original data, that's a great source of content. It could be brilliant for shares and visibility. You might even choose to partner with other creators with similar audiences and do a survey and report in partnership with them, and that can really help to grow everyone's audience as a consequence. Anyway, I hope those tips have been useful, and on a closing note, I'd be remiss if I didn't mention our own Indie Podcaster survey. Look at that, he's got an angle, which is running until the 11th of August 2025. It's a quick, easy and multiple choice format, and if you complete it, we'll send you a free PDF copy of our podcast growth book, which last time I checked, it cost about $30 on Amazon for the paperback, so that's not a bad wee bribe there, I like to think. There's also a prize draw to win $500 of quality podcasting gear from Lewitt, and we'll be sending out that PDF book copy to everyone who leaves their email for the prize draw, and we'll do that as soon as the survey closes. You can find the survey at thepodcasthost.com/survey25, or just grab the link in the episode show notes. All right, that's it. This has been Podcraft. It still will be Podcraft for the next 3 or 4 seconds. Thanks as always for listening, and we'll chat again on the next one.